Hello and happy Thanksgaming. Today I'd like to express my thanks to video games and to my viewers by bringing you along on a journey through my personal video gaming history via a series of Watershed games over the course of my childhood, teenage, and adult years. Those of you who have followed my channel for a long time may already be familiar with some of my history, but I hope that this provides you with additional perspective on my experiences as a gamer and consequently on your own as well. My video gaming life began around 1982. Imagine, if you will, the first home video game consoles are released in conjunction with the growing popularity of the very earliest arcade cabinets. At this time, the Pong cabinet was a mere 5 years old. Space Invaders, 4 years. Pac-Man, 2 years. And Galaga, only 1 year old. There was no NES. I never saw or played an Odyssey, an Intellivision, a Vectrex, or even an arcade game. My first video game, and the first watershed we've reached in my video gaming journey, is Asteroids on the Atari 2600/VCS. I played this at a neighbor's house when my family visited one day. It's a single-screen space shooter, and for me at the time, the definition of the very concept of video gaming. The Atari 2600 was the entirety of my video game life for the next 4 years. We never owned a video game console nor a home computer during this time, so all my gaming occurred at the houses of friends of the family. The irony was that I was too young for video game arcades, so I was introduced to arcade-style gaming via a home gaming console. At a babysitter's, I encountered my next watershed title, Vanguard. Similarly to Asteroids, this is a space shooter. However, rather than being a single-screen shooter, Vanguard scrolls both vertically and horizontally. It also includes something of a final boss and an ending. This was my introduction to these concepts in gaming. By 1986, I had the opportunity to get my first video gaming console for Christmas. My choices were essentially an NES or an Atari 7800. I was around 9 years old at this point, and having 4 years of video gaming experience on the Atari 2600, the obvious choice for me was the backward-compatible 7800. Before long, I had a black and white TV in my room, and for the very first time, was able to play video games for an extended duration without being interrupted nor being an interruption. Our next watershed game is the 7800 pack-in game, Pole Position. This was essentially my first racing game. With at the time cutting-edge graphics and 4 playable tracks, I was able to play from track to track in a mission-like progression, all the while keeping track of my high scores. During this time, I purchased, or asked to have purchased for me, the very first games I owned for myself. Our second watershed title on the 7800 is Joust, which was my go-to multiplayer game. This is the game that friends and I played whenever they came over. It's a co-op, single-screen, clear-the-screen style arcade game. Around the years 1987 to 1988, I began using the Apple IIe computers at my grade school on a more regular basis. In addition to the scholastic edutainment adventure-style games available to students, I ran across an, at the time, aging game that was nevertheless another watershed title for me, Zork: The Underground Empire. A text parser-based work of interactive fiction, Zork fascinated me with its tense atmosphere and obtuse puzzles. It was my introduction to the power of video games to immerse the player in a fictional world utilizing narrative and limited gameplay, not to mention zero graphics. Around 1988 to 1989, the NES was beginning to achieve widespread popularity. Having encountered the NES at friends' houses, a change in my living situation provided me the opportunity to have one in my household for the very first time. I was able to catch up on some already released titles, as well as play newly released games over the next several years. Our first watershed title on the NES is Golgo 13 Top Secret Episode, an action-adventure game combining side-scrolling, first-person, and shoot-'em-up segments with adventure game elements. Top Secret Episode was my first cinematic action-adventure game. Similarly to Zork, it built an immersive world via dialogue, but also included a mixture of action gameplay styles. By 1990, though I was now in junior high, I was still gaming and developing on the Apple IIe computers of my childhood. Study hall and a bit more autonomy led me to my discovery of a then 5-year-old Western computer RPG, The Bard's Tale. This Watershed title introduced me to the conventions of dungeon-crawling RPGs, including rolling character stats, choosing character classes, playing with a party of characters, and managing resources such as magic and hit points. Our next Watershed title, Final Fantasy, retained conventions of the PC dungeon-crawling RPG, adding third-person exploration of towns, dungeons, and an overworld. This is the first RPG I played from start to finish, and it piqued my interest in both Japanese RPGs and the RPG genre in general. By 1991, the arcade was finally more within my reach. A school trip to an amusement park gave myself and a friend the opportunity to have the then brand new Street Fighter II arcade cabinet completely to ourselves. This Watershed title introduced me to the concept of one-on-one tournament-based versus fighting using a range of special moves triggered by combinations of directional movements and button presses. At this point, video gaming was a fixture in the lives of myself and my stepbrother, and we each received a game console that Christmas. My brother, the then brand new Super Nintendo, and myself, the Sega Genesis, with the pack-in game, our next Watershed title, Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic the Hedgehog was the first action platformer I played from start to finish. Though I was aware of the impact of Super Mario Bros. On video gaming, and even owned Super Mario Bros. 3 myself, I was never quite able to get my head around those games and make their gameplay my own. Sonic the Hedgehog, on the other hand, I took to heart, though it did not ultimately make me a lifelong fan of action platformers like many other gamers became. Our next milestone is another computer RPG, this time on a home console, Might and Magic: Gates to Another World on the Sega Genesis. My next dungeon-crawling RPG after The Bard's Tale and Final Fantasy, Might and Magic Up to the Stakes with its sprawling, open-world style overworld, modern graphics, and deep gameplay. Our second Watershed arcade title is the 1992 light gun arcade cabinet, Lethal Enforcers. Though I'd played the NES Zapper game Duck Hunt, Lethal Enforcers was a stunning light gun experience with its modern, digitized graphics, reload mechanic, and flashy set pieces. It fostered in me a lifelong love of similar light gun shooters such as Maximum Force and Area 51. Amazingly, on Christmas of 1992, a mere year after my folks gave me my Sega Genesis, they got me the expensive Sega Genesis add-on, the Sega CD. Though I played and enjoyed then cutting-edge, digitized games such as Sewer Shark, my first year with the console was defined by the Sega Genesis pack-in collection and my very first music CDs. The Genesis pack-in for the Sega CD included the barely 1-year-old Streets of Rage, our Watershed beat-em-up. Though this genre was established with arcade games like Renegade, Double Dragon, and Golden Axe, the home console-developed Streets of Rage is a genre-defining experience. Music, graphics, and gameplay all come together to make a supremely enjoyable multiplayer co-op experience that is equally enjoyable single-player. 1993 brought a Watershed JRPG experience, Lunar: The Silver Star. Taking full advantage of the capabilities of CD technology, Lunar includes vocal musical pieces, a wonderful soundtrack, spoken dialogue, though limited, and narrative cutscenes. It's the first JRPG I played with characters who are set by the narrative, rather than rolled by the player, bringing it slightly more in line with more cinematic-style games I'd previously encountered. 1994 is a strangely sparse time for me in video gaming. Though I would go on to trade in my Sega CD, this would not be for another year or two. Around this time, I'm sure that I was playing video games, but I also started listening to music more and likely engaged in other hobbies. In 1995, I'd had the opportunity to play a number of PC games for the very first time on our vocational school's 486 IBM PCs running DOS. That brings us to our next Watershed PC game, Doom. Doom was a mega sensation. Following on Castle Wolfenstein, Doom introduced legions of new gamers to a rendering technology called ray tracing, and a gameplay style, the first-person shooter. This was my introduction to gaming on IBM PCs, and the idea of applying level and graphical mods to video games. It sparked an interest in many other games of the genre, such as Heretic and Hexen. It also introduced me to the concept of competitive, networked, multiplayer video gaming. This was not typically done over the internet at this time, but instead performed over local networks. 1995 was the year I got my first PC as a graduation gift from my parents, a then state-of-the-art Pentium 1 running at 100 MHz with a whopping 500 meg hard drive and 16 megs of RAM. It's also the year that the PlayStation 1 was first released. Though I would not get a PS1 for a number of years, my buddy was an early adopter, providing me the opportunity to play many of the early 3D titles on the system. These games were technically impressive, but occasionally experimental and of varying quality. 1996 was around the time that I was introduced to a paradigm-shifting concept, that of importing video games. My same buddy with the PlayStation 1 somehow encountered an import shop on the then burgeoning World Wide Web. The new hotness was the Japanese exclusive console, the PCFX. With zero Japanese skills and a rudimentary introduction to the anime scene then emerging in rental shops, local anime clubs, and commercial VHS sales, my buddy decided to import the PCFX with a few titles. I had also been working summers for a couple of years and had a bit more spending money. This was the time I engaged in what I consider my first retro gaming. I picked up a number of consoles, including the redesigned top-loader NES, a discounted Sega Game Gear, and a used SNES. This brings us to another Watershed title, Illusion of Gaia. This was my first action RPG, apart from games like the primitive Hydlide. Illusion of Gaia has simple but charming characters, music, and gameplay, and is one of the first Super Nintendo games I played from start to finish. In addition to my retro console purchases, I also bought for myself the still new Sega Saturn. Having gamed on the Genesis and Sega CD, the Saturn seemed like a natural choice. While I had the opportunity to play games on my buddy's PlayStation, the quality of the games at the time was not always impressive, and the platform was still struggling to form an identity. Its closest thing to a must-have title was still Battle Arena Toshinden. My with system purchase for the Sega Saturn is our next Watershed title, Dragon Force. Dragon Force is a strategy game with a sword and sorcery setting. You play as one of 8 leaders set on conquering the surrounding kingdoms. In order to do this, you send generals to the surrounding towns to recruit soldiers and attack enemy strongholds. This game introduced me to real-time tactical strategy gameplay, while retaining familiar elements from JRPGs I'd enjoyed on the Sega CD. By 1997, I had started taking my first Japanese language course at college, and my buddy was still importing the occasional game for his PCFX. Our Watershed title from this effort is Welcome to Pia Carrot, a romantic adventure game with simulation elements. Contrary to the modern notion of the romantic adventure game being a hardcore or comically unrealistic sexual fantasy seemingly fostered by online social sharing and shock culture, Welcome to Pia Carrot is rather a semi-realistic, narrative-focused romance story with simulation elements. Similar to early text adventure games or narrative-focused RPGs, Welcome to Pia Carrot combines text, sounds, and graphic elements to create a cinematic experience with atmosphere and intrigue that is frequently comical and heartwarming. It spurred my interest in Japanese language as well as fan-translating video games, and laid the foundation for my enjoyment of romantic adventure games and visual novels to this day. Contrary to its first few years, by 1998 the PlayStation 1 was taking off like a rocket into space, and I hopped on board. Its popularity was likely in no small part due to the release of Final Fantasy VII the previous year, though I completely skipped that game, instead picking up another Watershed title, Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear Solid is a clear evolution of the cinematic action-adventure games that came before. It takes full advantage of the then still evolving 3D polygon graphics, with a level of polish to its production that seemed unprecedented at the time. Unlike the nearly unplayable NES port of the original game, Metal Gear Solid used interesting characters, dialogue, and cutscenes to craft an engaging narrative while delighting with its stealth gameplay and tongue-in-cheek humor. Our next Watershed title on the PlayStation 1 is Gran Turismo, a simulation-style racing game with 3D graphics that were nearly unthinkable at the time. Only vaguely reminiscent of the home console racing games of my past, Gran Turismo added RPG-style progression to track racing, including earning licenses and money to purchase and upgrade licensed vehicles from actual car manufacturers. The level of customization and performance tuning on vehicles was something I'd never encountered in a game before, and it quickly became one of my most treasured gaming experiences. The releases for this system this year were on such a roll that another Watershed title was released early in 1998, Resident Evil 2. I missed out on Resident Evil 1, but now owning a PS1, I got to fully enjoy Resident Evil 2, and it's one of my all-time favorite games in one of my favorite franchises to this day. Again, an evolution of the cinematic action-adventure game, Resident Evil 2 combines action-adventure with tense atmosphere and campy but lovable characters. Its heavy focus on resource management rewards conservation and encourages a balance between fight and flight. The term survival horror has become problematic as the years go by, and I feel Resident Evil 2 has as much in common with Metal Gear Solid as it does with Night of the Living Dead. But the atmosphere of isolation and dread in Resident Evil 2 created one of the most unique gaming experiences at this time and has rarely been matched since. By 1999, I was fully independent, which is both good and bad for video gaming. Having recently purchased a PlayStation 1 and with my Sega Saturn collecting dust, I would not have picked up a Sega Dreamcast on launch. Luckily, I began rooming with a friend who decided to become an early adopter, something literally all of my close friends at the time also chose to do. I'm glad that he did because the Dreamcast has gone on to become one of my favorite consoles of all time. Our first Watershed title on the Dreamcast is Soul Calibur. Building upon the foundation laid by earlier 3D versus fighters such as Battle Arena Toshinden, Tekken, Virtua Fighter, and its prequel Soul Blade, Soul Calibur brought the gimmick of weapons-based combat to the versus fighting game. The ability to strafe and dodge roll, in addition to a number of characters with simple but effective movesets, make this game highly accessible. A variety of game modes and some more technical characters give this title depth. This was the go-to multiplayer game for my friends and I for years, and the gameplay holds up to this day. Our second Watershed title on the Dreamcast is the year 2000 title Dead or Alive 2. Though the first game appears on the Saturn and PlayStation 1, Dead or Alive came into its own in its second iteration, including an expanded roster of characters, a rock-paper-scissors style of blocking and countering, and destructible environments. The focus on beautiful female characters, unlockable outfits, and a certain goofy whimsicalness give Dead or Alive 2 an abundance of charm. Combined with excellent graphics and gameplay, Dead or Alive 2 is still a landmark in the versus fighting genre. Also this year appeared Space Channel 5. This Watershed musical rhythm game took the conventions established in Parappa the Rapper and expanded on them with a funky throwback to 60s sci-fi camp. Space Channel 5 showed that with some fun songs and personality, the rhythm genre need not be a mere fad or gimmick. 2000 also saw the release of a beloved and infamous personal Watershed title, Shenmue. A highly ambitious cinematic action-adventure game, Shenmue takes the cinematic elements of Metal Gear Solid and Resident Evil and combines them with a real-time, semi-open world that includes things like a day-night cycle and dynamic weather. The story of Ryo Hazuki's quest to avenge his father's death is offset by a variety of collection and mini-games. A beautiful game, set in the real world, Shenmue moved the genre of the cinematic adventure game forward in ways that are still felt today. Phantasy Star Online is our last Watershed game of 2000. Though I had experience with networked multiplayer gaming over LANs, Phantasy Star Online was the first genuine, massively multiplayer online game that I played. It wasn't until recently that I realized that the same gameplay principles that apply to the currently relevant Diablo 3 were what I enjoyed so much in Phantasy Star Online. Having never played Diablo 2, I don't know if it was a similar experience, but the game introduced me to the concepts of chatting with strangers during online play, grinding instanced dungeons for loot, and trading for rare equipment. At this point, we're still nearly 2 decades from the present, and at the very beginning of a console generation that is 2 generations behind the current one. However, we're starting to cover evolutions on genres, and I feel that nearly all of the games I currently enjoy can have their roots traced in some way back to the personal Watershed titles I've covered thus far. Therefore, I'd like to leave you with a few chronologies of games stemming from my Watershed games to the present. I hope that this was entertaining, and I hope it's helped you to think about what your own Watershed game titles are, and I hope that you'll share them with me in the comments or in your own videos. Thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe.